I'm Rabbi Sam Blumberg from Temple Beth, and we're so delighted again and honored that that you're joining us this evening as part of our LIZKOR to Remember initiative. Our mission is to honor our past for future generations, and tonight we are so honored and privileged to be hearing from Temple Beth member George Clymas about his and his family's story of survival during the Holocaust. George has had the opportunity to share his story before, and even in our community. And we know that now more than ever, it is so important that we take every opportunity to hear about experiences and realities of the Holocaust and share them with the next generation. And we see, and I don't see the number right in front of me, but just by the sheer number of participants we have with us this evening, we know how incredibly important this is. And this evening and its recording becomes a living history. It becomes a part of our Temple Beth LIZKOR initiative, as I mentioned, and we get to preserve this so that we can share with future generations as well. This evening is also a part of our upper school program. That is our 8th through 12th grade students and our teens. And we know that we have many community members, some who joined us just about 10 days ago for our wonderful program with Rena Finder and her sharing her story as well. So the format of this evening, we will have George share his experience with us, and then we will open up for questions. I'd like to open up for questions from our students first, and then we'll continue with questions from anyone else, and we can have you unmute during that time. But again, we ask that you remain muted for now. Now, I'm honored to turn it over to Temple Betham's Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Don Splansky, who will introduce George Clymas this evening.
Thank you for asking me, Rabbi Blumberg, to have this privilege of introducing George Clymas, Holocaust survivor and longtime Temple Beth member. The privilege, I know, comes from the fact that George had not spoken about his experience during the Holocaust until he and his wife Anita were part of a Temple Beth group visiting Israel in the year 2000. We had this terrific Jewish educational experience of visiting the land of Israel. I hope all our young people will have such an opportunity to visit Israel. For that matter, all adults watching, if you haven't yet been there, there's nothing quite like it. Not only a Jewish experience, but a life experience. And George and Anita were with us together with over 30 other people. And we knew that he had survived the Holocaust, and he was encouraged while on the bus to tell us something about that. He had not previously talked about the experience, which is not uncommon among Holocaust survivors. One can understand that that was a terrible time in their lives, any Holocaust survivor, and we have among our viewers Rena Finder, who spoke recently to the community of Beth. It takes a while before the realization hits that the only people who really know what happened are those who went through it. And they overcame their reluctance to talk about it in order to keep the story alive so that young people especially will learn and know. And George's story is a terrific one. When we arrived at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem at Yad Vashem, we came in, and the first stop as is usual, was the children's memorial building, where everyone walks through a very darkened building, and everyone's holding on to a banister on the right or the left, and the only illumination is from candles that are multiplied by mirrors, representing the 1.5 million children who died in the Holocaust. And when you come out on the other side of the building, while hearing the names of the children read aloud, you cannot help but be very moved that these innocent youngsters were murderously, viciously killed off. And something about that experience actually convinced George to share his story. And when we went up then to the Avenue of the Righteous in Hebrew, tzaddikim, we asked if he would tell us a little something about what he went through. He was for us the voice of experience, and there is a Hebrew saying, Ein chacham keba'al nisayon. There is no one quite as wise as the one who is experienced. And so he told us his story, how he and his family had been hidden by a righteous, non-Jewish family there in Budapest, Hungary, and how he had survived and then made his way over to the United States. We knew him as a fellow temple member. Some knew him as a worker at Raytheon. I understand he helped in the project of the Patriot missile, a surface-to-air defensive weapon that the U.S. shared then with Israel, which was very important for Israeli defense. We knew something about George, but we didn't know his story until he told us. And that's the point of a Holocaust survivor. That is, as the prophet Zechariah said, he was the firebrand plucked from the fire. And there is nothing quite like it to hear. So, and because of that, I asked him to share his story the following Yom Kippur with the whole congregation. He told his life story in the afternoon of Yom Kippur. Perhaps there is somebody still in our viewing audience that will remember that. And he is now telling his story to our young people and to all of us. And because he was willing to go to the office at Yad Vashem, the names of his non-Jewish rescuers, Elizabeth and Justy Maracek, are now part of that Avenue of the Righteous. And so I will tell you, George, we are indebted to you for sharing and for teaching and for being. And I turn this over to you now.
Okay. Rabbi Splansky gave you a background of how it happened that I have elected to tell my story to fellow congregants, and how we happen to walk through the garden of the righteous, and how these people saved my mother, my uncle, and me in the last few months of the Holocaust. This is in 1944. There are a lot of events that led up to that. And I would like to start off with the backup that I feel is necessary for you to appreciate what these people have done. As the rabbi indicated before, I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and as a child lived through the precarious years leading up to and during the Holocaust. Uncle Joe Clymas, who lived in the US, encouraged and helped my father come to this country in 1938. Our intentions were that my mother and I were to follow after he settled here. Unfortunately, with the advent of Germany, occupation of various European countries, and the influence on the Hungarian government relative to Jews, and eventually World War II, our immigration became impossible. It should be noted that contrary to the disastrous fate of Jews in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Russia during the years 1938 through 1942, we in Hungary did not have the same events. But after that, our lives are changed dramatically for the worse. To describe our existence during this period, I will relate some events. Toward the end of 1936, I had my first encounter with overt anti-Semitism. Grandpa and I were dressed up to go to Shabbat, to temple, and we were dressed, and I had a little suit on with a tie. And my aunt asked me to buy her some cigarettes from the local tobacco stand before going to temple. I went to purchase them and was confronted by two adults. They made fun of my slick down hair, the shirt and the tie, and made the following comment: "Look at the little Jew. Let's dirty him up a little bit." Obviously, I was scared, ran away, upset all the way home, and confronted my grandpa, explained to him what happened. And he explained to me that there were some people who did not like Jews, but we have to tolerate their insults. This explanation did not make sense to me. I knew that the news with regard to Germany, as I heard from the adults, was bad. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew that if you were a Jew, you had to be concerned. The year was 1942. I was in 7th grade. Anti-Semitism was rampant. In school, a physical ed requirement was that you had to swim and you had to qualify. But since there were no pools at the individual schools, the Hungarian Swimming Association provided time for the individual schools to allow the children to participate. Our gym teacher, who accompanied us, was a very fine man, liked by the staff and the students alike. We were all very excited about going to this beautiful Olympic-sized pool with its 5, 10, and 15-meter diving boards. We arrived at the lobby, and the attendant told our teacher that the Jewish students could not participate. I still remember the pool attendant making the following comment: "No dirty Jew will contaminate the pool that our athletes use." Well, our teacher was upset. We Jews were accustomed to being singled out. He did not experience this on his own. Anyway, he did something I hope that he later not regretted. he took our entire class to the Lukács Beth, where we were allowed to swim and qualify. And you see, there were still kind people, even when it was unpopular to go against the Nazi influence. At this time, the Hungarian students at age 12 began paramilitary training for approximately 4 hours per week. This time requirement increased as one became older until age 16. In 1942, when the country was mobilized, unfortunately, Hungarians fought against the Russians with the Nazis. Patriotism elevated this training to new heights. By more than Jewish men had been drafted throughout the country into work brigades. The authorities decided that Jewish boys could not participate in the paramilitary training corps. However, they were to be trained to dig slit trenches, lay barbed wire, and other activities that were necessary to the interest of the National Defense Act. This training was usually done in the suburbs, and it was not uncommon to see little 12, 13-year-old little boys wearing yellow armbands, marching through the streets, carrying heavy picks and shovels. Frequently, Nazis jeered and ridiculed them to the point where the humiliation was so great it resulted in tears. Other adults who witnessed these scenes of abuse had compassion, but were afraid to become involved, stopping the events to come. I too had to partake in this training. My grandfather took me to the local hardware store to buy my shovel. I was always little for my age, so the shopkeeper, who was sympathetic to the situation, sold us the lightest weight shovel in the shop. I was also the last one allowed to become bar mitzvah at our little neighborhood synagogue May 1943, a truly remarkable event. Jews were afraid to attend, and I had no friends with whom to celebrate. If I remember correctly, the participants were the rabbi, grandpa, one uncle, one aunt, a family friend, and my mother. Needless to say, I will always remember that bar mitzvah. At this time, I also had a little part-time job delivering yarn from a factory to shops downtown. I carried the yarn in a big backpack. It was not heavy. It was clumsy. While traveling on a trolley, I stood next to the driver's booth. At one stop, a Hungarian soldier got on, saw my yellow Star of David, which I had to wear, cursed me, and insisted that I get off. By this time, as I said before, it was wearing the Star of David. I told him that I paid my fare and retired to leave. At the next stop, he dragged me off and threatened me with his pistol and beat me up. I was bleeding quite badly. Sadly, again, people looked on, but nobody tried to stop this attack on a small 13-year-old kid. Late that month, Jews were consolidated into designated Jewish houses. My grandparents' home is a rather large one. It was declared a Jewish house, and Mom and I and 8 to 10 other families were to move in. For some families, this meant anywhere from 4 to 8 people to a room. Kitchen and bathroom uses were the biggest adjustments. This was the beginning of a total control the Nazis regime imposed over Jews. Listening to the BBC to follow the advance of the Allies was a crime. And one, if you were caught, you would be severely punished. During the later part of 1943, Jews had to turn in to the authorities their multi-band radios, cameras, cars, bicycles, motorcycles. We also had to wear the yellow Star of David and had to conform to a curfew as to when we were on the streets, to a couple of hours in the AM and a couple of hours in the PM. Needless to say, kids like me, cooped up, could not go to school or any other outside activities, were fighting continuous boredom. The house next to my grandparents was also a Jewish house. Between the two houses, there were at least 15 to 18 younger teenagers. We improvised by setting up little clubs for the little children, planting vegetables, setting up a little library, and played never-ending Monopoly games. Men, including my 4 uncles, were drafted to distant labor camps. The only adults remaining at home were women, the elderly, and children under 15. This is also a time when Jewish families attended mass conversion at the nearby Dominican church. They hoped that by converting, they would be spared from the inevitable, which was beginning to be known. Members of my family, some resorted to this option, except for Grandpa and me. I loved my grandpa. I had developed my aunt an attitude that I would not give in. This view of life has always remained with me. Because we had to accept this communal life, we adjusted to our miserable, confined existence. German soldiers periodically came to the Jewish houses looking for hidden male adults, weapons, cameras, radios, and jewelry. They could confiscate anything they wanted. It was a terrible event. In August 1944, my aunt gave birth to a son. My mother bought food to her at the hospital because the hospital was short on food and stayed after curfew. Prior to leaving, she removed her yellow star and attempted to come home. A competitor, a Gentile dressmaker, identified her to a policeman, and she was taken away immediately. At that point, I felt I left the family and went into hiding in the Buddha Hills. I had been a scout and was familiar with the mountains, trails, and caves. I met up with members of the underground and became a runner. I was convinced that my mother never would return and vowed I would never be taken away to be slaughtered without taking revenge on the Nazis. I was only 14 and a half years old and too young to be afraid. During my absence, the family obtained blank Swedish citizenship papers. My aunt, who was secretary to the chief editor of the local newspaper, made up these forgeries for everyone in my family. The family managed to get one of these to my mother. How, I don't know. She was at a holding camp. The authorities, confused by her status and the Blumberg pressure, thank God that, let her go. She returned to Budapest. When word got to me that my mom was at home, I did not believe it. I thought it was a trap, and I did not leave the mountains. However, a trusted friend substantiated the fact that she was at home. So I sneaked back to grandma's, and lo and behold, a Swedish citizenship document was waiting for me. In the fall, at the order of the government, in compliance with the Blumberg initiatives, we had to move to a safe house for aliens. We moved to a multi-level apartment near the Danube. Shortly thereafter, the Arrow Cross, which is a Hungarian Nazi party, gained full control. The orders of the day were daily beatings, deportations, and killing of Jews. In less than 3 weeks, the Arrow Cross had declared our papers illegal. Of course they were. While staying at the safe house, older and young adults, men, were taken to the Danube to load iron ingots onto ships which were to be shipped out to Germany. Adult males were sometimes after work were shot and dumped in the river. When I completed my third day of work and returned to the apartment, I saw that the Arrow Cross had raided the entire multi-story apartment house, and everybody had been taken to the ghetto. My mother escaped by hiding in a closet. Looting already has started. To survive, we had to move. But where? This was a very desperate time for us. It was also a time when a Gentile family, longtime friends, Elizabeth and Gusti Maricek, came to our help. They had a plan to hide us. Their apartment had a common wall with an abandoned yarn factory. Originally, Jews owned the business. Now it was officially closed by the Nazis and had sealed the door from the outside. It was a formal seed. Elizabeth and Gusti decided to cut a small opening in their bedroom wall that abutted the factory. They hung a Persian carpet on a rod and pushed the sofa against the carpet. This opening was to be our entrance to the factory and was completely hidden to anyone who entered their bedroom. After discussing the options and reviewing the risk to them, because we were very concerned for them, at their insistence, we accepted their offer. The explicit rules were to stay in the factory 100% of the time, never in the apartment. We could only whisper, never go near a window, no lights, no use of a toilet, no use of a stove, and no activities that might indicate to an outside observer through the window that anyone was inside the building. We had some mattresses on which to sleep, had plenty of blankets from the factory. Food was a problem. Because of shortages, everything was rationed. Friends shared with us what little they had. The risk to our friends was tremendous. If the Arrow Cross had discovered us, they would have shot us all on the spot. During the delays and the late days in the battle for Budapest, fighting became street to street. We were never sure that we would survive. Remember, we could not go to the basement. One day, bullet holes were above my head, right through the wall. I was lucky. The Russian troop entered our neighborhood in February 1945, a little bit later than we expected. The following day, broke into the sealed factory. They kept their guns pointed at us because of the status. they could not understand why we were behind sealed doors. Luckily, Mazel, the interrogating Russian major, was Jewish and understood my uncle's explanation. After the liberation, the Maricheks, my uncle, mom, and I moved and shared a suitable apartment until we came to the US in 1947. Needless to say, their actions allowed me to come to this country, reunite with my father after 9 years of separation, live a fulfilling life, meet my wife, raise our family, my daughter Julie, my son Rick. For years I wondered how to acknowledge all they did for my family. Our walk through the garden of Yad Vashem provided the answer. I am pleased to have accomplished this unfinished obligation by honoring publicly and for the record the heroism of Elizabeth and Gusti Marichek. The purpose of this presentation is to share with you events during the Holocaust and how it affected my life and life of thousands. It has been established that approximately 500,000 Hungarian Jews died during the Holocaust, which included my uncle Alan and my aunt Julie. And essentially, that is a terrible thing, but they were two in 500,000. That's what happened, folks. We will never let this event go stale. We have to make sure that our children appreciate what some generations before them had gone through during the Holocaust. That's my story for you folks.
George, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, for sharing the importance for our future generations, for remembering and for allowing us to bear witness to your experience as we gather together this evening. George, I hope that will you be open for some questions?
Yes, I will be.
Wonderful.
I am, I should say.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll begin, and I would love to open to our teens who are here first to ask some questions this evening that are on your mind, and then we'll open up to anyone else who has a question this evening. A reminder that this evening is being recorded and becomes this living document that we can share for future generations. Benji Wolf Wagner, do you have a question that you would like to ask this evening?
How did you and your group remain hopeful, even in the toughest times? What kept you going?
Benjamin, you do the best you can in a circumstances like that. You try to adjust and you hope that somehow things will change and surprise. You will find that people who were in this environment got tougher and tougher as the time had gone on. We had to be, because otherwise you just collapse and I don't want to use the word die, but you just know that you have to roll with the punches. It just so happens that perhaps I, as an individual, was maybe a little bit tougher than maybe some other people, as you can gather. And I don't know why, but maybe that had something to do with it. As I said before, I lost my father for 9 years, and I was essentially making some decisions as I was going along, even though I was maybe just 14 years old. Maybe that is the answer, Benjamin.
We'll move now to Nina Menzel to ask a question.
How did you feel about being singled out at like school and stuff apart from the non-Jewish people?
You mean while I was still allowed to go into school?
Yeah.
Well, remember what happened. When I could go to school until I was 13 years old. Now, I feel that anti-Semitism, as I told you, I believe it. For me, it happened when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. So to answer your question, you learn to be singled out. You learn to be singled out. But we were very, very fortunate, as I pointed out to you before, that in Hungary, we were just singled out. In the other countries, they were killed at a very early age. So I could not finish up my high school when I was 13. I just could not attend school. We were not allowed. But up to that point, I had to live with the consolidation of being a Jew. Does that answer your question, Inja?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Martine Schwann, another one of our teens, to ask a question.
Hi, thanks for sharing your story with us. My question would just be, during your time in the factory, like, I assume you had a lot of time to think. So I was curious, like, what were you thinking about in those moments? And were there ever any moments of hope in that time, even though it was so dark?
I felt safe in the factory because I knew that the people that were hiding us would never give us up. They were very good friends for years. And I felt safe because, remember now, the entrance to that place was sealed by the government with a big lock and a big write-up that this place is closed for everybody. So nobody would come through that door. Nobody knew that we were there. Now, we were hoping, obviously, that the Russians would come in a little bit earlier. As I said before in my little write-up, they actually didn't come in till early February. We thought they would be there by January, early January. And that was a concern. How long will it be before they come? Because you never can tell. Something might have happened in there that somebody had to come into the factory, maybe do some repairs or something, maybe a flood or something like that. And in which case they would be coming through the door, they would see us. But nothing like that happened. As far as how we spent the time, it just so happens that my mother and I and my uncle, we shared some stories of when we were young, when I was young, and we repeated the stories. And then once in a while, the people who hid us came in and we shared some stories with them. We would never leave that area because we would never want them to get into any trouble. But that's basically how we spent the time. We were hoping.
Lila Wolf-Wagner has a question.
I was wondering how you felt when the members of your family converted from Judaism.
I was upset. And I knew it was meaningless. I knew that deep down they remained Jews. But to the outside world, they were not Jews. However, again, as I said, I was kind of tough and I decided that I was not going to do it, and neither did my grandpa. Some aunts and some uncles converted. And as I said before, it was known that they really didn't want to do that. But by that time, we knew what was going on. We knew of Auschwitz, and we knew of Dachau, and we knew what was going on in the world. And some people felt that maybe that will eliminate the inevitable. And that's the way I felt about it. But to answer your question, I wasn't happy with it.
Allison Swartz.
Hello, thank you for sharing your story today. I was wondering what specifically about the Memorial Garden made you feel ready to share your story?
Why did I want to share my stories? Because I want to make sure that people know, like yourself, know what it was like during the Holocaust. And we must avoid that kind of a environment in the future for any groups. This is terrible. That was terrible for selecting. The Germans decided they're going to kill all the Jews. Now, what else can be said for people in the Nazi regime conceivably think that this thing is a valid thing? We must avoid it. That's the reason why I feel it's important that people hear this. And there are people, as you well know, deny that the Holocaust ever happened. Well, we got millions of records indicating of what it was and how many people died. So as far as I'm concerned, I will try to do my best. And I have tried to pass on to people what I knew personally. Does it answer your question, honey? Okay.
Jordan Spector will ask a question next.
Hello.
Hi, Jordan.
Question is, for you, in your opinion, when did it feel like life was starting to get back to normal for you?
Okay. When I came to the United States, came in on a Pan Am flight, and this was in 1947. And my mother pointed out to me a person at LaGuardia on the balcony, and she said, "That's your father." To answer your question, that was the beginning. Because remember, I had to share with him 9 years' worth of absenteeism. It was big for him too, and it was big for me. I'll tell you the truth. It was very difficult to adjust to the fact that I had a father who would tell me what to do, when to do. Remember, I was only 17 at the time, and not even 17, just almost 17. And as I said to you before, I made decisions on my own. And for my father to tell me what to do, he was very smart. He knew that it will be mutually advisable that we understand the relationship, but there is no question about it. It was getting to, for me, was when I saw my father for the first time after 9 years. And from there on, everything went great. High school here, and friends, learning the English language. I served in the military, went to college, and as a rabbi said before, I worked for a company for many, many years. But it really started when I saw my father for the first time. Does that answer your question, Jordan?
Thank you. Do any of our teens have a follow-up question or something that they'd like to ask? I believe that we've heard from most of our teens and want to give them the opportunity. If you do, you can just raise your hand under reactions and we'll make sure to call on you. Otherwise, we'd like to open it up to anyone who has a question. if you'd like to ask something and come off of mute, we'll just ask that you use the reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen to raise your hand. That puts you sort of at the front of the line, and it makes it easier for us to see you and to put you on screen. Well, as we're waiting for that, George, I have a question about the Marichek family. Oh, great. We have a few more as well. I'm curious if you heard or were part of any of the conversations with Elizabeth and Gusti talking about what sort of the risks and the challenges of hiding you and your family in the factory and where you were. Were you a part of those conversations at all? Did you hear a little bit about the back and forth and what the considerations were?
Rabbi, I don't quite understand. Are you saying that did we discuss with the Marichek family the fact that they have elected to do this? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you shared when you were speaking. You said that that you did speak with them, and you thought about, it sounded like your family was saying, we don't want this to be an undue burden or a major risk to you.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can share anything else about what that conversation was like.
Well, yes. As I told you, when you left the Swedish house, which was raided, and everybody was taken to the ghetto, they knew we were there, hiding still. We were the only ones for a couple of, and they got a message to us that they wanted us to come for dinner. Okay? So what we did, my mother and I traveled independently, not together, to their home at night in the dark. So nobody could see us, or the likelihood anybody seeing us would not know that we had gone into their apartment. And we stayed there. And that was it. The decision, we didn't know what they wanted. We thought it was, like, we know a place where you could hide or something like that. It had nothing to do with staying with them. And that's the reason it was a shock for my mother and I. As a matter of fact, my uncle was already there. He came back from labor camp, and he was also very friendly with them. And they put him up already. In fact, I think that he might have helped putting that hole in the wall. I think he might have. So we did not know that we were going to stay there. We were trying to figure out what we're going to do. We thought we might have to go out of the country, to the suburbs or someplace, and try to hide that way. So we were surprised. And of course, we were very concerned that what happens if somebody finds out that they're hiding us.
Thank you. We have one question in the chat, and then I see that we have some hands raised as well. So Lino Kovarubius is asking in the chat, any relationship with the family that helped you hide? I presume afterwards.
Absolutely. What happened, as I said before, when things were over and the Russians came in 1945, February, right after that, we shared an apartment and we lived together. We lived together for 2 years. It just so happens that even though my father and my Uncle Joe were trying to get us here, between the Russian authorities, the Hungarian authorities, American visa, it was very, very difficult. So we were there, we shared an apartment there for 2 years. As a matter of fact, I would go to the countryside and bring food back, because back then it was a problem. And we shared with them. Now, after we came here, we corresponded, of course. Now, it just so happened that by the time I have done what happened at Yad Vashem, they both died. So they didn't know that. I'm sorry for that, but that's the case.
Thank you, George. And they're remembered now for all time.
Yep.
Sue Siegel, would you like to unmute?
Yes, George, and thank you again for sharing this really powerful story with us. I was actually at Yad Vashem.
You were one of the ladies. You were one of the 32.
Right. So we talk about Vador from generation to generation, and I would like to know how, if you could share with us how you influenced and guided your own children to ensure their generation of continuing their Judaism and their children's.
Both Ricky and Julie attended temple education. They grew up. I feel that their choice of how they handle their lives, relative Judaism, and their average life is something that they have to learn. I feel that it's more important to influence your children to be racially smart enough to know that they would never support anything that I have gone through. Other than that, decisions relative Judaism, how you practice it, it's in the family. It's in the immediate family. And therefore, I think I influenced them to make that decision one way or the other. I don't know if that answers your question. One of the 32. Hi, Sue.
Stephen, Barbara.
I want to thank you very much, George. It was a very, very educating experience for Barbara and I. My question is, how did your faith, or how is your beliefs in God affected by what the ordeal was? Did you any question why the relationship with God and yourself during this whole trying period?
I believe in God. There's no question about it. But I think there is a reason why Mom, my uncle, and I survived. There's a reason. I don't know why. Millions died. We survived. Why did we survive? Maybe we survived because we had to do things in our life that if I would not be around, would not have happened. So to answer your question, I think if God made me stay alive, I had to do some things that I feel that I'm proud of. Whether it was something for mankind, something for people that needed help, organizations. I was on the board of the temple for years. I believe we have been temple members for about 55 or 60 years, something like that. And I continue doing that. So to answer your question, what happened to me I did not lose faith in God. If that's your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Carol.
George, thank you so much for sharing.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. It's a story that you know is very meaningful to me because my family on one side comes from Budapest and specifically from Zalaegerszeg. Alan and I went to Budapest twice, once in 1970 and again in the early 1990s. I was there with other cousins. We were able to meet survivors of the Holocaust. That included my cousin, but we called him Balash Bachi, Uncle Balash, who was an attorney prior to the war, and during the war moved to the Buda Hills where he had a secret radio and published a newspaper that was delivered by one of his sons on a bicycle. So I wonder, so we learned all these stories by going back. Have you ever been able to go back to, or did you have the desire to go back to Budapest?
Anita and I had gone to Hungary twice. Not only did we go and we made the rounds, my grandmother's house is still there. And it just so happens, Carol, that my son was at the house, my daughter was at the house, and two of my grandchildren at different times were at the house. And I have pictures of them outside the building. So to answer your question, we went back and we went to see it. Now, the house right now is no longer an individual place, but it was turned into offices because it's a big house. It was offices. And it just so happened that when my son and my daughter-in-law were there, that was 2 or 3 years ago now, they found somebody who could speak English, and they were able to go through the apartment inside the house. So to answer your question, we had gone back, we made the rounds. I went up into the mountains and went back to where I was bar mitzvah. As a matter of fact, one of the jokes is that a gentleman came, we went to a Shabbos service in Hungary where I was bar mitzvah. And this gentleman said that anytime you drop in, you can come to services. And I told him, I don't frequently drop in here. but that's a story. To answer your question, yes, we have been back.
Good. Thank you, George.
Yes, dear.
We'll talk.
Yeah. Köszönöm szépen.
Köszönöm.
2 questions that have come in through the chat, and then we have 2 more hands raised, and that might be all we have time for this evening. A question that came in to a direct message for me from the chat from Emma Morgowski, who's one of our teens. She asks, what is the most important thing that you have learned from this experience that has caused you to act differently in your relationships while with others? Did you become any more or less trusting of others?
No, I did not become trusting. I'm thinking right now of colleagues at work, and I'm thinking of neighbors, and I don't think I ever became less trusting. I never ran into anybody that I felt that in some way or other warrants consideration for my relationship.
Thank you. And another question in the chat, how did you survive hiding in the Buddha Hills? Impact of weather, lack of food and resources, and any loneliness?
Loneliness was not a problem. I managed that. Food was a problem. There were farmers. I traded things. Some of the farmers had nothing to do with the Nazis. So in some ways, they didn't ask what I was doing there. As far as they knew, I was a scout going in the mountains, and I would trade off something for food. As long as I had bread, I did survive. So as far as the food is concerned, I traded whatever I had. I had some money that I took with me. I traded my watch that was nothing expensive, but somebody wanted it. My total stay in the mountains at that time was about 6 weeks. So I managed to survive that. That was the period of time between my mother was taken away and I found out that she was back. So it's about 6 weeks. And at that time, there was no snow in the mountains yet.
Andy.
George, you mentioned that you had heard of Dachau and the death camps.
Yeah.
And you knew the Russians were coming and expected them in January.
Yeah.
How did you get word of what was going on in the outside world?
We didn't know that. we figured the outside world, well, first of all, we knew about Auschwitz and we knew about Dachau.
How? How did you know about that?
Before hiding, we knew about it.
How did you find out?
When we were in the Swedish house, the Wallenberg house, we had information there. There was a radio. That's where we found out. Up to that point in time, we had outside world information. But it is after that we lost it. So when we left the Wallenberg house in November, we knew that the Russians were in the outside of the city. And that's the way we got.
Thank you.
Yes, Andy.
Amelia.
What did your children and grandchildren say to you once you started to share your story with them?
They know my story, but to what degree they really know the details, I'm not quite sure. Hopefully, they will take an interest in it and will clarify even more questions that they may have, which I will have to answer. I have 4 grandchildren. They are all grown, and they all know that I'm a Holocaust survivor. They know that.
We have time, it looks like, for these 2 last questions of hands raised. Alex, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Grandpa.
Hi, honey.
There we go.
I didn't want to take over anybody else's time, but I remember talking with you a couple years back because I was wondering about a lot of different things, and I had heard different things at my bat mitzvah, but not other things that I heard today. And I was just wondering, going forward, one of my responsibilities to you as a family member, but also just as someone that I love and someone who doesn't want to see anything like this ever happen again, it was kind of codified in policy. It was codified in policy to kill people because of the regime. And it kind of encompassed everything. So I was just wondering, we're not having that kind of policy now, but we still see book burnings and we still see a lot of other kind of worrying things going on in the world right now that's leaning more towards less democratic countries and stuff. And I was just wondering, to prevent something like this from happening again, we had talked about talking to representatives and educating people and talking about stuff, but I was wondering if there was anything else that you'd want to tell people to do going forward to keep this from happening again with everything that's been happening in the past couple of years.
Somehow we have to make sure that our government and representatives that run our world, that they actually do the right things to avoid that kind of a situation. And as such, we got to be careful who we elect to represent us. And I hope for the best. And to answer your question, yes, we should all work in making sure that what I experienced and what you know about it does not happen again to any groups, whether they are Jews, Catholics, Baptists, anybody. That's a good question, honey. Love you, sweetheart.
How beautiful and wonderful. Alex, thank you. And thanks for being with us tonight. We'll give the last question to L. Clymas.
Hi, this is Alex's mom and George's daughter-in-law. And I just have to say, you just heard exactly what type of man George is. My father-in-law, I think, is a tough survivor, never gives up with anything that's a challenge in his life. But what's most impressive about him is that he is the most incredible, hopeful, giving, gracious, forgiving, and loving man I have ever met. And him and my father were a lot alike. And I say this with so much heart. He has never, ever led or dealt with anybody with any anger or vindictiveness. He always seeks out the best in everyone. He's accepting of everyone and looks at the best of them. And if they're not the best, he tries to help them. And this is an incredible man. that we should all be proud that has survived the Holocaust. And I got to say, his mother, who lived to almost 101 and was in New York City, was incredible just as much as him. I did not know his father, but these are people that, after going through all the horrendous things they've seen, are the most incredible people, and humanity is how they live their lives. And I thank you, Dad, for that.
Thank you, sweetheart. I love you.
I love you too.
Wow, how beautiful, and what a poignant and wonderful way to end our evening together. What an incredible man and an incredible story. And George, we are so incredibly grateful to you for choosing to share your story, for choosing to share your story with us tonight, for being so open and giving of your time and in patiently answering questions. It's such an incredible zchut, a merit for our community, that we could have this time together, and that we now we have this story, and we have this evening's recording, and all of the questions and all of the challenges and the hope that comes with it for future generations that we should never forget. Thank you so much, George. Thank you to Rabbi Splansky for being with us this evening. Thank you to Bill Rabkin for helping us with the tech, to Sue Siegel and Ellie Anbinder, and many others who are working with us as part of our LIZKOR to Remember initiative, to our teens for asking such wonderful questions and being with us and open this evening, and to many more who I know I've forgotten, and I apologize, but thank you. And thank you most to George. We so appreciate it, and are so grateful that you've shared your story with us tonight. We'll close out our evening, and if on your way out tonight you'd like to, and I already see it coming into the chat, if you'd like to put your thanks into the chat so that we can see it, we can hold on to the transcript of that chat and also share it with George and his family afterwards. We'd be so grateful. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Laila Tov.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you for doing this program.
Thank you. Thank you.